Not just ministering to his churches and being a pastor to these churches in Corinth and in Rome and in Ephesus, but he's also trying to frame himself apart from Peter and James and the Jerusalem church, who is trying to, or who believes that everybody needs to be Jewish before they can be Christian. That they have to get circumcised, they have to follow the law, they have to observe the religious holidays, those things. And Paul is very adamant that they don't, and he's trying to make that case over and over and over again. But he's trying to make that case in a situation, in a context where Judaism is very important to these people. I think one of the mistakes that a lot of modern critics of Paul make is that they want to strip him of his Judaism. And I think that that's a very culturally imperialist thing to do. Paul was a Jew. Paul grew up as a Jew. He tells us in Galatians he was the most zealous of all the Jews. He was going around persecuting Christians, not because he was mean, but because he really believed in this faith that he had grown up with. And so at the point that he has his call on the road to Damascus, whatever that looked like, he then has to wrestle this new revelation he's had of Jesus Christ into this faith that he has carried with him and that's been central to his entire life up to that point. And so to think that, to impose on him 2,000 years later and say, well, he should have just left that all to the side and only gone with this very limited, sense of who Jesus was, is to strip him and his followers and these churches of who they were. And we can't do that. So when Paul is writing thousands of letters of really dense theology, trying to work these new things that he's understanding into this faith that at the time was thousands of years old already, or hundreds of years old already, he is trying to make it all make sense to himself and to his readers. And we're trying to do the same thing. So I think it's really important to see that. And so you'll see today as we go through this how Judaism plays such a big role in shaping the letters of Paul. So keeping that in mind, that conflict with Peter and James, it's really important. So again, on your paper you have the 7 concepts. I've been thinking about this lesson a lot this week, obviously, to the point where on Thursday when I was really buckling down and working on putting together the slide and the handout and everything and just getting my script together for this, I sat down and wrote, I think this is 14 pages of just, because I think narratively. And so I was like, I've got to sit down, I've got to take these concepts and I got to write them into the story as Paul has them. So I'm not going to read you this. Yeah, Phyllis, will you hand her that one? There you go. Yeah, there should be enough. I think I printed 20. So I won't read you all of this. I could. I've done academic conferences where you stand there and you read the papers to everybody, but I'll try not to do that to you. But I am going to reference it, and I may read parts of it, just because this stuff is hard. It's hard for me even, and I have been thinking about this stuff for a decade now. So in order that I get it right and that I stay true to what I interpret this to mean and what I think Paul was saying, I may at points reference this or do a little bit of reading from it. So let's get into these 7 concepts because I think they're really important. Or before we get into them, any thoughts as you've sat with Paul for a week? Did anybody get a chance to read the verses that I talked about last week? Do we have anything that came up as a result of that is coloring your thinking coming into today? I also know we have some different folks with us. I don't really mean to put you on the spot, but I also, we can get other voices in here, yeah? I'm going to give you the mic and just... Rigid? You're fine. Let me see if I can get it turned on. They like me to use the mic so that it's on the camera and all that stuff, so you can be on the video.
I've always thought of Paul as being kind of rigid.
As
and
rigid?
He seems to go to me, and I'm sorry, I read everything at the top first. Mm-hmm. Then I realized, this wasn't the homework. But anyway, it's almost like he speaks both ways, that you shouldn't judge, but then he's telling his followers what they need to do. Mm-hmm. And I'm not sure how much in this part, like speaking in tongues, which I agree with him. on that it doesn't make sense to anybody why do it.
Yeah.
And I don't know, when I read some verses that were the end of a chapter that weren't on this list about women, and I thought, no wonder we have trouble.
Exactly. And nothing that I do over these course of these weeks, thank you, is to minimize those parts. And in fact, that's what we're going to get to on the 28th, is we're going to talk about those verses about women, his references to homosexuality, his references to slavery, and the way we should relate to human authority, all those things. He is rigid at times. I think that's a good word. And he does do that thing where he says don't judge, but he's giving these instructions to people. It's really complicated. He's trying to manage these churches and these people. He's trying to guard against these super apostles, these voices coming in and upending the work that he's done. He's trying to do that while also preaching a gospel that for him is predicated, one of the words on there is freedom. The freedom to live into your calling as it speaks to you. I think that's a really good things to notice. And I think one of the benefits of the way we look at the Bible, which is not as the literal, infallible Word of God, is that we can remember this is a person, a very human person, I like his theology. I like a lot of his writing. I think he's a warm writer. He also, like we said last week, very argumentative. He took things very personally. And you could see that in his writings. He was hot-tempered at times. And he had his own shortcomings. And so I think engaging all that stuff is really important. One of the things that made me think about when she said that was he says in one of his letters, I think it was in Corinthians, he says, I try to be all things to all people. And it's when he's making his point about preaching to Jews versus preaching to Gentiles. He says, when I preach to Jews, I'm a Jew, and I've observed the Torah, and I've been circumcised, and I'm steeped in this culture. But when I go and preach to the Gentiles, that doesn't do me any good. So I preach to them. I go to the Gentiles. I'm as a Gentile. And in fact, in the book of Acts, I know we're trying not to rely too much on Acts because it was written long after him, but we see some of his preaching. He goes to Athens, and he stands up on the Acropolis, and he references Greek gods. He references, to make his point, to make this case for Christ to the Greeks. So he's willing to be flexible within his preaching, but he's also going to be rigid in the sense that he has a very firm vision of what he is doing and of what his message is, and he's going to try and stick in there, and he's going to try and make the situations he's in conform to that. So thank you for your thoughts very much. Anybody else before I launch into these 7 concepts? Yeah.
Yeah, it definitely made me think about Chris's session in the fall about how to read the Bible. Mm-hmm. I couldn't help but, especially the direction to read a couple of versions of Romans. Was it Romans? Romans 8. Yeah. Definitely could see the differences between the translations, but also it made me question, okay, why are these particular translations focusing more on spirit or not, or whatever. But to the point about the person of Paul, what you said reminded me about how in the Jewish tradition it was expected that there was debate. Debate was expected. Mm-hmm. That was part of the process. That was the expectation of the males, is not only to learn it, but to be able to debate it with other people. Yeah. And while he had a tendency to be hot-headed, while there's others that might have been more calm in their debate, now I can see why, okay, well, I can accept his character a little bit easier, that there's a lot more context to this than just the words on the paper. Yeah. And he's a lot more interesting as a human being than he is as a infallible orator of theology, right? He's a person. He's trying to figure these situations out, and it's hard. I was thinking something based on what you said, and it just flew away. Where did it go? Translations? Yeah, translations. Yeah, I think that's an important point.
these are translations. They're translations largely from Greek, which is a difficult language to translate in English anyway. A lot of the concepts don't match up. So a lot of the translators are doing their best with the language. We'll see that today when we talk about faith and the theological virtues and the way it's understood in the scripture, and the way it relates to some of the other verses in Romans 8, for instance. But you also have to remember too, Paul was writing these not just to be read on paper, to be read aloud. So he would send these letters. For instance, he's sending 2 Corinthians with Titus. That's what he says in the letter to the Corinthians. Titus would have been expected to read that letter aloud, and not just read that letter aloud, but comment on it and supplement it and answer questions and debate back and forth and criticism. So the churches at the time are not just encountering these texts as static texts on the page. It's a conversation that they're having within their church and with Paul and with Titus or Timothy or Apollos or whichever is coming, and also with those other voices, the enemies or the super apostles that Paul names them in the text. So it's all a rolling conversation that's going on. Yeah, go ahead.
In my context as a student, I can't help but now wonder, did he send these as study guides?
Study guides. That's a good way to think.
Conversation prompts.
Yeah. Well, and one of the things this book has brought to light for me too, that it was common sense when I realized it, but I didn't think about it at the time. You take a book like Romans, he didn't sit down and write Romans in one day. He likely constructed this letter to Romans. He knew he needed to write a letter to that church. He had a reason to. But then over the course of weeks, he's conversing with Timothy and Titus and his other followers. He's writing and crossing things out and rewriting. So these were processes. Even the writing of these letters was these long processes of hashing these things out and working these things out.
I was just thinking that Paul even says of himself that I believe that he was much more effective probably in his writings than he was in person. Mm-hmm. So, and that's easy because, sometimes when you have time to think about it, you're able to construct it a whole lot better than you are thinking on your feet. And that's one of the things I noticed about Paul.
I can sympathize with Paul. He talks in there a few times about his letters, about how he is not a good speaker. Some scholars think maybe he had a speech impediment or some tics that were particularly noticeable. So he probably presents himself much better on the page than he does in person. And in fact, some of the criticism he gets from the Church of Corinthians is that he's not a very impressive speaker. He's kind of quiet and retiring and those kinds of things. So that all plays into it too. It does. So, I appreciate those thoughts. I'm glad you guys thought about Paul this week. Welcome to my world. You're thinking about Paul during the week. That's what I do. So let's get into these so we have time to run through all of them. Over the course of preparing for this class, reading back through Paul's letters, reading some of these books, just getting my head around Paul's theology afresh. These are kind of what I boiled us down to. These kind of 7, did I get all 7 in there? I didn't. There we go. These 7 concepts, I think, encompass Paul's theology pretty well. There's some other words we could throw in, and obviously boiling, all his theology that's been thought about and written about for 2,000 years down to 7 bullet points is probably a fool's errand in and of itself. But it's the best we can do because we have 40 minutes this morning. And so I think these 7 concepts really tackle the meat of Paul's theology. As I was working on this, an important part of it for me was thinking about in what order to present them as. Because Paul's theology is not these 7 bullet points floating within a cloud together, kind of, like molecules bouncing around off one another. Putting them together in a certain order is important to understanding his theology because it's kind of a scaffold. It builds you up, and it's what Paul does. If you think about the book of Romans, it's these 16 chapters, it's really long, and he's building this argument across chapter to chapter. He's starting with, this condemnation of the law and how the law works, and then going into talking about whether the law has an impact on the Gentiles, and he builds from there and there and there and there. And so what I'm trying to do with the order they're in here is the same thing. So I probably could have even numbered these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 down the list. So we're going to go through these in order, and hopefully you'll see how they kind of hold together to present one unitary picture of what Paul is doing, which if we jump back here for just a second, remember, is to preach Jesus Christ and him crucified, which was what he wanted to do more than anything else, and specifically among the Gentiles, but not just the Gentiles. He was talking to Jews too. And so we'll see that in here. So the first word I have up here is cruciform. This is a really hard word. Cruciform just means cross-shaped, basically is what that word means. For Paul, this is the essence of God, of Jesus, of the theology. Everything is shaped by the event of the cross, including God. He said, if you want to know what God looks like, you look at the cross. Now, what does that mean? I like that concept. It's very central to my theology. It informed a big part of my thesis work, was this idea of the crucified God as a specific kind of God. But it can be really hard to hear. I think especially in a lot of the progressive churches I've been in, we don't necessarily like to center the cross. And specifically, we don't like to center the cross with Jesus on it. I wrote a couple weeks ago on my blog about crucifixes and how I grew up Lutheran. And one of the things we talked about, that I grew up very conservative Lutheran, and there was this very strong polemical argument that Lutherans made about we don't put Jesus on the cross because that's barbaric. It's what Catholics do, and Catholics follow the Antichrist. So we just had an unadorned cross. And I think, and that has kind of carried across, I think, to some more progressive churches. We don't necessarily want to think about, what's the right word for this? We don't want to think about how brutal and barbarian that is. And I agree with that in some sense. One of the things that Dr. Robin Myers from Mayflower in Oklahoma City talks about is this idea of if we did that in modern times, we would have, instead of a cross on your necklace, you'd have an electric chair. And that would be very shocking and very barbaric. But it's supposed to be. The idea of a God, if you know, and I'm speaking for Paul here, you know, not necessarily the theology that you may buy, but if Jesus Christ was God on earth and was put in the electric chair, was crucified, that means something. That means a lot of something. That's a big deal. And so, you know, despite the best efforts by some Christian voices to use that death and that resurrection to be all we know about Jesus and to drown out the ethical implications of the words that he said throughout his life, Paul is very clear that the cross is the fulfillment of all those teachings. So Jesus is going around and preaching about loving one another, giving yourself up for others, all these things, and that the cross is the ultimate moment of those teachings. That Jesus said, love your neighbor as yourself, love your enemy, and love God. And Jesus was willing to live that out up to the point of being crucified by the people that he spent his entire life with, by going up on the cross, by forgiving them, and by dying. And not just that, for Paul, the cross isn't the end point. It wasn't Jesus died and that's it. Jesus died and Jesus was resurrected 3 days later. So the cross and the resurrection really fulfills for Paul Jesus' teachings. And so Paul calls us to imitate that. He says, you must live a cruciform life. What does that mean? You must live a life that is cross-shaped. Just as Jesus was willing to love others unto the point of death, so we are called to live loving one another, serving others, giving ourselves up for others, unto the point of death, would say Paul, which is really hard to hear. And I don't know that I'm up for that necessarily every day. I don't know about you. That's a really hard thing. If you look at the back of your handout at that Philippians hymn, this is why I included it in here. Was there any other ones laying around here, or did we get them all passed out? Because I didn't bring my own copy. So, oh yeah, I didn't realize you didn't have one. There you go. So this hymn, or this passage from Philippians 2, verses 4 through 11, Paul is writing to the Philippians here, and these lines, the ones that are lined out like stanzas, is a hymn that he's quoting. Paul didn't necessarily write this hymn. Maybe he did. Scholars don't necessarily think he did. Scholars think this was a hymn that the early church used in its worship services as kind of almost a creed, because it takes that form. It sounds like the declaration of what they believe and the implications it has for them. And for Paul, this hymn is really important to this letter. He shapes this entire letter around it. So one of the things that Gorman points out in his book is if you look at the way this hymn runs and the way it's set up, the letter mirrors that. So he's trying to draw on it. But what the hymn says, he's talking about Jesus Christ. He says, "Let the same mind be in you that was in Christ Jesus, who, though he existed in the form of God, did not regard equality with God as something to be grasped, but emptied himself, taking the form of a slave, assuming human likeness, and being found in appearance as a human, he humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross." Yes? You can go and talk, but...
I'm loud enough, but just in case. That's actually something that hit me when I read this, that Christ coming as a Jew who versus, I mean, they're all Jews, sorry. He didn't come as a Pharisee. He didn't come as a Sadducee.
Yeah.
So he came as a commoner in Jewish understanding.
Yeah.
So that was something I'd never seen before.
Yeah, he did. I mean, he was just like, I don't know what the equivalent would be, a working class guy. You know, he wasn't some bigwig. He wasn't, a priest necessarily. He took the name rabbi, or he took the title rabbi, but that just means teacher. So the important part about this hymn that I want to point out, especially there in verse 8, where he says he humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. And in verse 7, where he says he emptied himself. If you want a good theological concept, this is known as kenosis. It's a Greek word. It means to empty yourself or to let yourself go. So Paul, in calling us to a cruciform life, is calling us to a life of a kenotic life, a kenosis life, where we empty ourselves for others. We take on that form of the cross, and we live for others. All right. So, and that's what this hymn is kind of getting at here. He's commending the church at Philippians for being willing to do that. All right. So, cruciform is our first term here, and that's very. If there's one term that kind of umbrellas all of this, I think that's the one that does, definitely. So our next term, covenant. And this is where we're starting to get into some of the Jewishness of Paul. So if you remember, one of the most important marks of the Jewish faith was this idea that they had a covenant with God, enacted through Abraham primarily, but also through Noah, through Jacob, later through Ezra and Nehemiah, who had kind of a covenant with God in going back and rebuilding the temple. The covenant was very important to what it meant to be Jewish. Well, what was this covenant? The covenant was that the people of Israel would follow God's law, the Torah. They would live in obedience to the life that God wanted for them. And in return, God would make them as numerous as the sands on the beach or the stars in the sky, I think is kind of a rough translation of what Genesis says. He would sustain them. He would give them a nation. God would give them a nation. He would spread them out and make them his people for the whole world. Excuse me. Which is a big deal. They were a small group of people who had fled from Egypt later in their history. They didn't have a lot of power compared to Babylon and Assyria and all these places. And so having this assurance as a people from their God, that their God would not give them up, and would not let them be conquered and destroyed and assimilated into another empire, but be their own people forever, if they followed God's laws, was a big deal. And so that covenant is really important. And the sign of the covenant for the Jewish people was first and foremost circumcision. That's what God told Abraham to go do. Circumcise yourself and all the people in your household and your children. It was an outward sign of this promise they made to be faithful to God and faithful to the covenant promises of God. All right. So Paul, as a good Jew, is not just going to discard this idea of covenant. He's not going to say, this guy Jesus died in Jerusalem and now the covenant is null and void. You don't have to think about it anymore. He says what Jesus came to do, and Jesus' words too, was to fulfill the covenant. and supersede it in some ways with a new covenant. So Paul is very adamant throughout his letters that the death of Jesus, the death and resurrection of Jesus, inaugurated a whole new age and a whole new covenant that took that old covenant, that was the promise of God to the Israelite people, that he would sustain them, that God would sustain them and make them a people for the whole world. Through Jesus, God is now extending that covenant to everybody, to all people, everywhere. Anyone who is faithful to God can be in that covenant. And Paul, when talking about the covenant, uses familial language. He says you are adopted in as an heir of God's covenant. So it's not just a legal covenant, it's a family thing for Paul. All right, all people can come in. And through this inauguration of this new covenant through Jesus, it's not through following the Torah. It's not through observing Jewish religious festivals and eating kosher and being circumcised. It's through faithfulness to God, which we'll get to here in just a minute, and we'll get to how that makes sense. But it's a new covenant is what you need to know. But covenant is still really important to Paul. It's very important to Paul. So far, cross-shaped life inside this new covenant. Those two things come together to give us our third term, freedom. So through this new covenant, through our faithfulness in this new covenant, living for others, willing to give ourselves up for others, is found a kind of freedom. So Paul says the promise of inclusion in God's family forever through the death of Christ frees us to live that cruciform life. This is really important for Paul. Freedom is a crucial attribute of God for Paul. So Paul alludes to the fact that God is free to enter into a covenant with people and chooses to do so. And so we get to partake in that freedom. All right? We, through the death of Christ, through Paul's understanding of the death as a victory over sin and over death. Paul says, through the death of Christ, death no longer has power. Sin no longer has power over human beings. We are freed to then live this love, this cross-shaped, loving life for others. We don't have to worry about whether we are being too loving towards others. We don't have to worry about whether we are being too generous with our stuff. We don't have to worry about whether we are wasting something by loving every person that we come into contact with. Because God has assured us, the death and resurrection of Christ on the cross, that finality, that finitude, that bumping up against some cosmic wall where everything ends, Paul says, no, that doesn't apply to us. We are free to live and love and give and be extravagant and be wasteful with our love and with our compassion for one another without any worry that it's going to run out, without any worry that we're going to love somebody so much, too much, that we then condemn ourselves in some way. This gets us, we'll talk about in a couple of weeks, to a really good argument for LGBT inclusion in the church. That God's love is so expansive. We don't have to worry about who's in and who's out. Everybody's in. And if you're standing before God at the end of all time, you know, if you believe in such a thing where you're going to have to account for your sins before God, that you're going to stand before God and say, I don't know, God, I loved people a whole awful lot. God's not going to say, oh, that's not good. That's okay. That's what we're supposed to do. We don't have to worry about it. So freedom is really important to this concept, and it's a byproduct of living a cruciform life inside this new covenant, as we have this freedom within this covenant. From freedom, we then shift to the theological virtues, and these where I want to get to, because these kind of play this, if we have, you know, cruciform plus covenant equals freedom, and kind of circling around it like little atoms or protons is these three concepts of faith, hope, and love.
I just have a question. On our handout, you put positive and negative.
Oh, positive, negative, thank you. That's a good point. I really like positive, negative freedom. I get really excited about this idea. It's philosophical. Positive freedom versus negative freedom. Through our freedom, we are not just, our freedom is not to just, God doesn't just say, okay, you're free, go do whatever. That's positive freedom. If we want to be really polemical about it, say that's like American freedom, like I've been freed from any bonds or anybody telling me what to do. And there is the sense of that. Freedom includes positive freedom. We've been freed from the bonds of death through the cross. Death has no power over us eternally. But that's not the end of it. Paul tells us we have been freed for something as well. We have been freed to go and love. So you can't just, the freedom found in the cross is not a libertarian freedom where you live out on your own. You're free of everything. You have no shackles on you. You are free to now go and do something. Paul writes a lot about being slaves to Christ or slaves to God through this. He said we've been freed to become slaves to God, which doesn't seem to make sense, but you're freed to become a slave of the power of love, to go be loving in the world. That's negative freedom, is I've been freed for something, not freed from something. Does that make sense? Oh yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because I had a quote from Galatians I was going to say here. So in Galatians 5, verses 13 to 14, he writes, "For you were called to freedom, brothers and sisters. Only do not use your freedom as an opportunity for self-indulgence, but through love become slaves to one another. For the whole law is summed up in a single commandment. You shall love your neighbor as yourself." And if you didn't catch that, that's Jesus he's quoting in that last line. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. If we're still worried about Paul discarding the words of Jesus. No, not at all. He's expanding upon them. All right. We're going to get to our theological virtues here. We're going to have to run through this stuff fast because I'm running out of time. I could do this, like I said, for weeks. We could spend 6 weeks just on cruciform alone. Ask Tabitha.
Go on a road trip with him.
I would love to.
The best thing, we lived up in Chicago when I was in seminary. We'd have family dinner. We'd host people at our apartment and make dinner, and we'd also have adult beverages. And you get all of us in our apartment together, all of us theology students, drinking and eating and getting a little, affected by our alcoholic beverages. And then we're all talking theology till 2 a.m, slightly drunk. And Tabitha's just sitting there like.
Thinking of the Augustinian debate was until about 4 in the morning, and I was like, y'all, I have to come out.
So I could do this for a long time. One of the notes I put in there was if anybody's really interested in this, I'm happy to do a Bible study on Romans. If you want to spend a year going through the book of Romans, I'll do it. I'm just kidding. Not really. I would do that. So faith, hope, and love. We need to talk about these. These are really important. So again, if we have cruciform and covenant giving us this freedom, then we have faith, hope, and love kind of floating around, infusing all of these things. So let's talk about these really briefly. Hope. We talked a little bit about hope up here with cruciformity. We have a hope through the cross of the defeat of death. It infuses us with hope. Love kind of speaks for itself. I've said the word love, I feel 100 times already this morning. Love is kind of the central virtue. When Paul quotes these, he says there's faith, hope, and love, and the greatest of these is love. Love is the ethical command of all ethical commands. It's what we're supposed to do. What does it mean to be a Christian? We love. We'll know we are Christians by our love, That song, yeah. And love, I think love is really important. One of the chapters I had you read was 1 Corinthians 13, which is the love verses. I used to not like 1 Corinthians 13 because you always heard it at weddings. It just felt cheapened. Yeah, and I don't mean that for anybody who had 1 Corinthians 13 read at your wedding, but it gets, I think it gets cheapened into this romantic, oh, I love my partner. Sentimental. But it's a really profound, it's one of the central texts of Paul's theology. And I think, it's one of the reason I signed it last week, because it's really important to understand it. I printed the whole thing because I was thinking about reading the whole thing to you all, but I won't do that to you because we're almost out of time. But it's a great part. It's one of my favorite parts of the Bible now. So finally, faith. This is the one I want us to focus on because it's the most difficult, I think, of the 3 theological virtues. Faith. What is faith? What is this idea of faith? For Paul, faith plays a really important role in these things that we'll get to here in a moment: justification, righteousness, salvation, all these big, really dense theological words that aren't a lot of fun. What they are all pointing to is the work of faith and what it means. And faith is bound up with the covenant. So we talked a minute ago, this new covenant that that the cross is inaugurated is not one that's defined by our adherence to law, to Torah. We don't keep our end of the covenant by observing specific rules laid out in the book of Leviticus. Let me back up. We don't do that that's not how we hold up our end of our covenant. However, any covenant has two sides. God is doing something for us, overcoming the power of death, welcoming into this new family. What's our side of the covenant? What are we supposed to do? We aren't free from everything. We have obligations. We have obligations to love. But we also have an obligation around faith, around faithfulness, if we want to extend that out a little bit. We are called to be faithful to God, primarily through the act of love and loving one another. Matthew 25, as you did to the least of these, you did to me. That is love operating in faithfulness. All right, we're being faithful to God through love. Faith is a difficult concept. You often hear it paired with justification. Justification by faith. Faith, not works, right? Again, I grew up Lutheran. Faith, not works is very central to what we talked about. We didn't get to heaven by doing good deeds. We got to heaven by saying the right words. I welcome Jesus Christ into my heart as my Lord and Savior. Doesn't work for me, no, necessarily. However, and I've always struggled with this, and I've struggled with it, and it's so central to what Paul's doing. It's like what Romans is about, is justification and how it operates. This book, if you want a good book of theology to read, this one really shattered how I think about justification and reformed it in a way that is just amazing. What Campbell says, and what I've come to believe now, is that faith, so often it's rendered as justification by faith. Let me make sure I read it right. The righteousness of God through faith in Jesus Christ for all who believe. God is righteous. God is sticking to God's part of the covenant through our faith in Jesus Christ for everybody who believes in Jesus Christ. So by our action of the covenant of believing in Jesus as our Lord and Savior, God is upholding God's side of the covenant. That's how you often hear it. It's not how a covenant works necessarily. It's not a contract where we agree to do something and God agrees to do something in turn. So we're covenanting together and we both are going to do something at the same time. So how do we rethink this? Campbell says that this translation of faith as just righteousness of God through faith in Jesus Christ is a bad translation. He says it should read, let me get this right, the righteousness of God through the faith of Jesus Christ for all who believe. Not faith in Jesus Christ, faith of Jesus Christ for all who believe. And so what he means by this is that through the faithfulness of, that got really messed up. Through the faithfulness of Christ, being willing to love humanity to the point of going to the cross and dying, through that faithful action. Because you remember, that's an act of faith. Christ gets up on the cross and says, my God, why have you forsaken me? So God is not, or Jesus in that moment is not assured of this hopeful outcome that we're wishing for. Jesus is going through this on faith. Through that faithful action, by our participation in it, through our own cruciform life, do we fulfill the covenant? Do we find justification? Justification is kind of a legal term, means that we're okay. God says, you're good. So this kind of takes us down here to participatory, which we'll get here in a minute. What it means is, I know this is dense, and I've tried to pare this down, but this is really thick stuff that we're going through here. What this means is that our faith is participatory. We are called to participate in this cruciform covenant life. We are called to participate in this renewal of the covenant for the whole world, of making the whole world reconciled to God. Reconciliation, there's one of our words. All right, reconciliation means that we've been estranged from God in some way. Whether we believe Adam and Eve and the story of sin, I think that there's no doubt that in some way, through some actions that we've taken, through the way the world is set up, we have been separated from God in some way. and that we are striving to get back to God. We are striving to be reconciled. And what Paul is teaching us is that our reconciliation is enacted through our participation in a specific way of life that looks like the cross. See how it's all kind of like working together here? If we live in faithfulness to the work of Jesus on the cross, if we don't let ourselves lose hope, if we're willing to love others, hold up our end of the covenant, we put our freedom towards something, then we start participating in the work of reconciling ourselves to God. See, it's a scaffold. It builds. This is why I get excited about it. It's really cool. I think it's really cool. Righteousness is a word that kind of relates up here to freedom and covenant. All right, it's a way of being. We are called to be righteous. We are called to live in a certain way. But righteousness is really hard. We're called, the traditional way of that faith in Jesus Christ puts the work of righteousness on us, that we have to live right. But when we change those words, when we translate it differently, and we say the faith of Jesus Christ, the faithfulness of Christ on the cross, the work of righteousness is transferred to God. God is the righteous one. We don't have to worry about it. That's part of that hope again. That's part of that work of that wasteful work of love. We don't have to stress about getting it right. All we have to do is love other people as much as we can. And if we screw up, we screw up. But God took care of the righteousness part for us. We don't have to worry about it. That's what Paul is saying here. Does that make sense? I hope it does. It's really, it doesn't always make sense to me, but I try to. So my last one here, as we're running out of time, very quickly. All of this, these first 6, is a very specific way of living. It's a very difficult way of living. The reason Paul wrote thousands and thousands of words and letters and letters and letters, and people debated it and talked about it and have done so for 2,000 years, is because all of this is really difficult and it's hard to figure out. The church, in its best forms, has taken on the obligation of helping all of us figure that out together. The church hopefully educates and calls people to lead congregations, to lead denominations who help people live into this form of life, a cruciform form of life in this new covenant, freed for others to love, to live in faith and hope, to be assured of our righteousness and our justification before God, to participate in the work of God through the church. This last one here is countercultural, and this leads us to what we'll talk about in 2 weeks when we come back. All of this, in its best form, should lead to a very radically countercultural way of living. For Paul, it did. For Paul and those early churches, they weren't living in a dominant Christian culture where it said, in God we trust on the money and all this stuff. They were living in a world that was pagan, was Jewish. We were living in a world that the emperor was God. And so living in this way, and they were living in a world that was defined by strength, much like the world we're in today. There's a lot of overlap there. This was a countercultural way of being. It was entirely new way of living, not just in a social justice, feeding the hungry, cleaning up the environment, whatever way, but in every facet of life. And so this is what we'll get to in 2 weeks. I don't want to give away too much from 2 weeks. What Paul does with all of this is he applies it to every facet of the life of his congregations. And that's why he talks about, for instance, what women do. That's why he talks about slavery. That's why he talks about the powers and principalities in Romans 12. And we, 2,000 years later, are reading those verses through a lens that Christianity is at the center of everything and drives the power. Paul was not writing that in that way. So we're going to see how in 2 weeks, how when Paul is writing about the role of women in worship, while it is very culturally centered, and it does sideline women as agents in the worshiping process, contextually, relatively to the world he was living in, it was a very countercultural call. And we're going to talk about that in 2 weeks. So all of this leads to a countercultural way of being. And my last point, and I'll let you go for real, is it leads to a way of living. So I have this book called Resident Aliens, my favorite theologian is this man, Stanley Hauerwas. I have all of his books. He's my favorite by far. He wrote this. This is probably his most famous book. And he writes that the church is a colony. We should think of the church as a colony because that's how Paul thought of it. That's how Jesus thought of it. It was not the center. It was a group of people within something larger. All right. So he said, Hauerwas writes, we are resident aliens. We are citizens of this covenant kingdom of God, who have been sent out as aliens to live in a colony amongst a different kingdom. And we do our work from our colony. Now, we don't stay with it. We don't build walls around our colony. Our colony is meant to, in the words of Christ, be a leavening agent to change that colony. But we're called to an entirely different way of life. That's what we'll get to in 2 weeks. I could run right into that right now, but we don't have time.
We also call some of this like, well, it seems at some point this may be over language somewhat, where it's transformational, that we're transformed into a new being.
Yeah, and that's very, transformed into a new being, that's a very Pauline language. That's how he would have phrased it, I think. It should affect a transformation. And it's part of why the church has, for a long time, done things like confirmation. They do baptism, and you go through a confirmation class. That's usually some period of time. In my denomination growing up, it was a year's worth of confirmation classes. The original idea behind that is that the church is preparing you for this way of life. They're teaching you what it means to be a Christian. Like Christianity, it's not just something, you don't just say, well, now I believe in Jesus Christ, I welcome him into my heart, and I'm a Christian. And Paul's way of thinking was, it was a way of life. You had to be initiated into this. Yeah. And if you think about, these house churches kind of existing underground in Rome, in the city of Rome, the earliest churches were like in these crypts underneath the streets. And there was a lot of this overlap with like these mystery cults where they had to come in and you go through this initiation ritual, and they would go through baptism. We talked about, that coming out of this Pharisaic background of Paul, this ritual cleansing, and then they'd come up and they'd be donned in all white after coming out of the baptismal font, and it was like you were reborn into this new way of thinking, and then you were taught how to be a Christian. And after you went through confirmation, after you got baptized, you couldn't just start taking communion. You had to prove that you were living as a Christian before you could come to the table. Now we've shifted that. We have an open table policy, which I think is the right thing to do. But you kind of get the sense of what they're trying to do. They're trying to shape people into a new way of being. And Hauerwas writes a lot about that the church's job is to shape people in a certain way, is to shape character through the institution of these theological virtues into every aspect of your life. So anyways, we are almost at 10 o'clock. I don't want to keep you. If you want to go, I'm happy to stick around and answer more questions or chat about this. Again, ask Tabitha. I'll talk about it all day. Very happily.
I think Ruth read a lot of papers.
But I appreciate you all coming back out. I hope this wasn't too dense. If there's anything I can clear up, please let me know. In 2 weeks, we will apply these 7 ideas to real world examples of what it means, what Paul understood it meant to be a Christian. And we'll hopefully not dispel. We're going to sit with the fact that those verses suck and that they say things about women and gay people and all kinds of people that we really don't like. But we're going to try and reread them and reclaim them, because one of my things with Paul that I say all the time is I don't want to cede this ground to fundamentalists. It's too important. It makes up too much of the Bible. We can't just say, well, y'all get that and you get that in your arsenal and we're just going to give it up. No, we get this too. And we're going to read it in a way that makes sense to us because we can. Because, like I said, it wasn't just a letter that Paul sent statically. It's a conversation. It's a process. It's, to use a Jewish term, midrash, where we're going to talk these things through and figure it out together. So thanks for coming. Pete ends next week. I try. Pete ends next week, and Reclaiming Paul in 2 weeks. I don't have suggested reading. That's last week's. If you want to go find some of the stuff that's in Paul that's not great, 2 Corinthians has some. 1 Corinthians has some. You can read Timothy, 2 Timothy. That's stuff that people attribute to Paul a lot. Romans, the very end of Romans chapter 1 and the beginnings of Romans chapter 2 is another place for that as well. So, and the letter of Philemon. A lot of places. We'll tackle all this in a couple weeks. Thanks, y'all.